Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today we're going to be talking all about performance states, performance experiences, and joining me today is Bernadette Kellermann. Bernadette, welcome to the show.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me.
I am super excited to talk to you about a topic that is a passion of mine, given that so much of my own consultancy work is at the elite end of sport, where we talk all the time about performance states and performance experiences. Bernadette, to start off, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. I'm currently in my third year, so round about halfway through, perhaps. I'm part-time at this point. And my background is music performance, so
Okay.
I didn't take the conventional route towards psychology. So I completed my undergraduate degree at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and then went on to do a master's in Edinburgh in performance psychology. And this was really kind of the first contact point with psychology, and a bit of a rough landing in some ways because I had to catch up on some things I had no idea about. But it was, I saw the relevance and the connection, and it was fascinating. So this is kind of where it started for me.
Now, I'm not detecting a super strong Scottish accent there, Bernadette. Where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Germany, and I moved in 2014 for my undergraduate degree.
Whereabouts in Germany?
In Regensburg, which is round about an hour and a half from Munich. So close to the Alps, but also close to Czech Republic, kind of in the corner.
Okay, beautiful. And so you came over to the UK, you came over to Scotland for your undergrad?
Yeah. So Glasgow has a Royal Conservatoire, and this is actually also a bit random again. Everything is a little bit unconventional about my education, but I studied traditional music, so mostly Scottish and Irish music, and a big part of that is composition as well, and maybe going into a little bit of jazz. Basically, anything but classical music.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm classically trained originally,
Yeah.
but my degree was more about kind of oral traditions of music, informal settings of music. So the learning is very different. It's not,
Yeah.
here is a movement, go memorize it.
Okay.
It's a lot more organic, and you need to work a lot more flexible.
What instrument do you play, or instrument?
Violin, mostly. A
Okay.
tiny bit of piano. I can't say I'm playing piano.
Okay. Does that mean you're piano grade 8 or something like that? And you're like,
Oh
no, I
no.
can't really play piano, but grade 8.
Oh no, just enough to like help me through some composition stuff of trying to play chords, and
Okay.
but no.
Yeah. Just the basic Rachmaninoff,
Oh yeah,
basically.
for
Yeah,
sure.
right. Okay, so you play the violin, and so you've grown up in this performance arena playing music, and you ventured into, I suppose, performance psychology. You're doing a PhD in performance psychology now. I mean, what took you down that path? Did you have some performance challenges yourself from a psychological perspective, or was it just something that captured your interest and imagination as you were playing and performing?
Mhm. Yeah, maybe I think a couple of things played a huge role. I think there's actually a lot of performance psychology in a music degree without it being explicit. So
Okay.
we had performance classes, and that consisted of like you have to go on stage and perform and do your thing, and but no one really tells you or teaches you or trains you in how you perform
Mm.
actually. So some people get really crippling anxiety. And if they perform well, that's all great. And if they didn't perform well, this is just kind of their loss. So it's a really brutal environment.
Mm.
And while I was there, I was thinking, there's really actually nothing that helps musicians learning how to like be a long-term performer, not just live from performance to performance, and then compensate like with just a crazy lifestyle anyway,
Mm.
usually. So yeah, that was one thought that I had, but I didn't realize that that would be related to performance psychology necessarily. I didn't realize until I did the MSc in Edinburgh, and I was like, oh wow, they're talking about all this stuff in a sports context that I recognize from a music context, and it was really fascinating. I mean, I didn't know there were actually techniques like imagery. I didn't know there were techniques that would help performers negotiate like pre-performance anxiety or something like
Yeah.
this. Like it wasn't it wasn't anything that I was really aware of because it didn't come across it in a conservatoire context. So I went through and did the MSc course, and you have to write a dissertation at the end. And back then, I was taught by Alan MacPherson, who's now my PhD supervisor as well. And I was at this point, I was like, I want to do everything but performance with music. And I was like, let's do some sports stuff. I don't want to go near musicians for
Okay.
this. And and he was like, what? But wait, you have all this access to musicians, and it's actually really fascinating what you do. And in a way, like he kind of restored my my faith in music performance a little bit. And I ended up writing about shared mental models in non-classical musicians, so kind of the musicians that I worked with. So I was working with 6 jazz musicians, and we looked at how shared mental models work in their context. So that was like for me a key experience where I was like, oh wait, this sports research intersects with my experience as a performer, intersects with other performance contexts, and it's something where I maybe have a more or less unique angle on where I know what it feels like to
Mm.
perform. I need to talk to musicians very differently than I talk to athletes. So it's like it's just different contexts. So this is kind of how I then ended up in performance psychology.
And before we move on to the topic that we want to talk about today, um, you do have some athletic background, don't you? You participated in track and field, running. Am I right in saying that?
Mhm. Yeah, I did. I mean, mostly running. Been running since I'm 13, and before then, I did ballet,
Okay.
which is an interesting combination of the music and the
Yeah.
athletic side of things, obviously. But so yeah, but I didn't ever run or do ballet to the same kind of almost elite level as I did with music.
And so you did your masters, and you studied shared mental models. And actually, I'm half tempted to have a conversation about that today, because I find shared mental models both fascinating and highly important in
Yeah.
sports. But we'll save that for another day, another episode, because I really do want to dig into performance experiences, performance states, and that
Mhm.
really is that. Would you say that that's kind of the topic, the overarching topic of your PhD?
It is, yeah. Peak performance and how self-regulatory strategies fit into um, that frame. I would say it's yeah, a more nuanced view onto peak performance thanks to the multi-action plan model.
Okay.
But yeah, it's all connected to self-regulation. So how do we actually help athletes to attain states that are like long term worth maintaining?
How do we help athletes find those mental states that help them high perform? And I got in contact with you. I think we follow each other on Twitter, and I saw that you posted one of the papers that you're that you've completed and has been published for your PhD. It's entitled
Mhm.
"Reading the Map," map in capitals, a pracademic perspective on the current state of play of the multi-action plan model with regard to transitions between mental states. And like so many academic titles, that may sound scary to some people listening. Well, what is that? But essentially, it's exploring those peak performance states, as you've said, which I think all of us are interested in and invested in multiple performance domains in our life. But specifically, you are interested in, and you're studying something called the multi-action plan. And I think we were talking off air before I pressed record, and multi-action plan I think is fascinating. We're going to unpack that today with your help, and I think it's fascinating not least because it's not necessarily something that people know much about. Even I dare say a lot of sports psychs may not have come across quite a bit of this research, and yet it collates so much great research that's out there on peak experiences. And I think that's going to be a great place to start, Bernadette. So a broad question here, but tell us a little bit about multi-action plans with relation to peak states. What's this all about?
Yeah, so I'll always shorten it to MAP because otherwise
Let's
it's
shorten it to map. That's easy. Yes, thank you.
it's a long it's a long
It
long
is.
term, and it may be confusing if we get onto all the different characteristics. So MAP is basically a framework that defines 4 performance types: type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. And I think this is already a big benefit of MAP. It is very, very complex in the sense of there are lots of characteristics associated with each of those types.
Okay.
And these characteristics are around cognitive factors, they're around emotional factors, behavioral, even some psychophysiology. So the community of researchers that have worked on the MAP model have really done an excellent job of categorizing these 4 performance types like very diligently and like very detailed. So what they are essentially is type 1 is a type of flow-like experience. So everything is going pretty well. The performer doesn't need to um, do too much for it to
Yep.
actually go really well. It's fairly effortless. It's a pleasant state. It's also not too. They don't have to be too conscious, so it's more kind of monitoring, supervising the task. Type 2 is different to that because there are some obstacles starting to creep in. So the performer has to put more effort into the task for the performance to be going well. It's still optimal performance. It's still going really, really well in terms of the end result. It's just like the pursuit is more effortful. And because it is more effortful, it's also a little less pleasant. It's a more um, it's it's just a more fatiguing
Yes. Yeah.
peak performance state. I think that's maybe actually to be fair, this is the fatigue aspect is not anything that's currently in the MAP
Okay.
concept. It's something that's
Okay.
come out of our research. So, but it's something the performer has to work harder for it to be optimal. And then when we get to type 3, this is when the performance deteriorates. So type 3 and type 4 are suboptimal states.
Okay.
Type 1 and type 2 are optimal states. Type 3, the performer has to put even more effort into performance, probably even too much effort. So there is some element of overthinking perhaps happening. There's what we would call reinvestment. So it's an a negative or more negative state, in a sense that it's unpleasant. There's loads of effort going in. It's not necessarily paying off. And this is kind of where our paper comes in. There might be little windows where it's possible to get out of this type 3 state again. But we'll get to this later. So type 4, everything is in a really bad place by this point. It's
Sounds like my golf.
well, I'm gonna describe it, and you can judge for yourself if this is the case.
I know already. Trust me. No, go on, please.
So the performer kind of starts to withdraw mentally. It's a state where they're maybe giving up in some sense. They're just maybe just running down the clock, trying to get the performance event finished. And this is maybe an interesting characteristic. So MAP at this point says this is a pleasant state because it's something where you've just kind of checked out. You're not really engaged in the performance anymore, but it's also something where you maybe don't really care too much anymore. So you've distanced yourself from it. So 4 different types: 2 optimal, 2 suboptimal, and 2 states where we need a lot of effort, type 2 and type 3, and 2 states where performance is pretty automatic, type 1 and type 4. So these are kind of the main dimensions of MAP.
I'm just going to reflect back what I've heard, because you've neatly summarised there for me at the end. But I just think this is so important, because this is when I first picked up this literature several years ago, it resonated with me so much. And we'll talk about some of the underpinning theories for the geeks amongst us in a second, because it does bring a whole bunch of theories together.
Yeah.
But where this really resonates with me, Bernadette, and I'm not going to ask you a question here, but maybe you might have some thoughts on what I'm about to say, is that as a consultant, as a practitioner, as a sports psychologist over the last 17 years, these 4 performance types that MAP, multi-action planning, consists of are so in line with the conversations that you have with people when they're reflecting on their performances. Type 1, flow. Hey, Dan, I wasn't thinking about it. I just went out and played, went out and performed. And that's often what you hear when you start to. So often my question to performers is, well, tell me about you at your best, because you're trying to get them to think about what that experience was like, and to grab hold of some clues and some cues and some triggers. And I wasn't really thinking. And that's quite synonymous, as you've eloquently described, akin to flow. And then there's type 2, which is the effortful, where it's fatiguing, but you're putting in effort. You might be experiencing that in a pleasant way, but you're really having to work hard. And I know it's not exactly the same, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but type 1 flow, type 2 kind of has been in the past with sports psych, on the sports psych show, been described more as a clutch type performance. We spoke with Dr. Christian Swan about that. We spoke with Dr. Matt Schweikel, both researchers in Australia, Wollongong. And then type 3, effort but too much
overthinking,
task irrelevant cues, negative states, and then that 4th one, withdrawal, giving up. Have I kind of grasped those four types?
Yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah, okay. And so tell me a little bit about, again, this is going to be for the geeks out there, the geek in me, around the theoretical underpinnings here, because we've talked on the Sports Psych show about challenge and threat states. We haven't talked much about other stuff such as individual zone of optimal functioning, but we talked about acceptance, commitment a lot. So tell me a little bit about how this draws together a lot of performance psychology theories.
Yeah, so as you said, there's quite a few in the underpinning framework
Yeah.
of MAP. The beautiful, before I go into these specific concepts, I want to say like the beautiful thing about MAP is that it doesn't um, it doesn't draw on one specific model. It's
Okay.
rather that like tenets of all of these apply at the same time and in an idiosyncratic manner. So idiosyncratic
Yep.
means it's specific to one performer. Even if one
Okay.
performer to the other performer, like they're doing maybe the same task, it's still specific to one performer. It's very individual. I think the best way to describe it is maybe MAP produces or really frames case studies of each performer. It's a very, very, very specific approach. And I think in that way it's a very respectful approach as well for to use as a practitioner, because you
Mm.
are approaching each performer with a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity. So idiosyncratic, I'm going to use that word probably quite a lot. um, so yes, so you mentioned mindfulness, acceptance, commitment. Interestingly, this concept so far hasn't been corroborated in MAP. So this is where Mac and MAP are different things. So so far, the MAP literature says the mindfulness, acceptance, commitment approach would come into play in a transition from type 3 to type 2. So from a suboptimal, effortful state to a optimal, effortful state. Um, and this so far is just a hypothesis. It's not been corroborated. And this is, again, where my PhD research comes in with, because I want to look at the transitions between these states. We're looking at cues, we're looking at strategies. So stay tuned for the next paper.
Awesome.
There might be some element of Mac, and actually which is then supported by evidence. So it's yeah, this is one tenet of it. Individual zones of optimal functioning is another one that you mentioned.
Hmm.
Eyes off is really focused on the functionality, the arousal, like the emotional part of peak performance.
Yep.
Again, the cool thing about MAP is it looks at emotion, but it also looks at many, many, many other factors. So
Yes.
in that way, ISOF is part of MAP. It's not too like detailed in the sense
Okay.
of we're contextualizing everything that has to do with emotion through ISOF.
Yep.
It's really part of a bigger model. So you mentioned the multi-states theory, I
Hmm.
think.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is where the idiosyncratic part comes in. So it's really individual. It's a very personal connection between the performer and the task and the environment. So it's again very individual, very idiosyncratic.
Yep.
Um, MAP doesn't want to make generalizations necessarily. It says this is an individual experience. Therefore, we will contextualize this on an individual basis. One concept I think that you didn't mention there was making it happen versus letting it happen,
Okay. Talk to me
which
about
is
that.
which is like this a wonderful concept between clutch and flow. So flow, everything is automatic and effortless, and it's somehow elusive as well. It's hard to attain.
Yep.
Clutch being this conscious concept of peak performance when it really matters, but you have to be really switched on to be able to do it well. So making it happen is you have to put effort in to perform well. Letting it happen is more like the supervisory role. I would say making it happen is actually quite like type 2. So there's a lot of commonalities there.
Effortful.
Yes, exactly. So it's um as you can see, there's like, I want to say like 30 years or actually 30 plus years of sports psychology research, um, contextualized in map. It's quite an undertaking. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
really complex model, but the complexity and the messiness of it is what makes it interesting, I think.
Hey, and please correct me if I'm wrong here.
Mhm.
Challenge threat involved at all? Challenge and threat states, or not so much?
Yes, yes, actually, yes. I'd have to go back and look at the original paper because
Yeah.
um, it was listed in the original table. Absolutely, yeah,
Perceiving the situation as there's a perception of control, a self-efficacy, as in self-belief, relationship to
yeah,
perceiving the situation as a challenge rather than a threat.
yes, yes. So type one is described as like a challenge state, like an optimal state. Type
Yeah.
2 as a threat state, type 3
Okay.
harm, and type 4 benefit. Um, I would say just from the work that I've done so far with the review, the narrative review, and also the empirical work, I think we need maybe a little bit more nuance with that because I think type 2 and type 3 especially, there's a lot of different directions there. So it might be like a low type 2 or a high type 3 in the sense that it's more like a spectrum. And there are different elements of these of a challenge or threat
Yeah.
appraisal that may apply at different points in the performance. So I think, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little bit more complex, but there's more work that needs to be done there. So
Yeah, I mean, hey, these things are always work in progress, aren't they?
yeah,
But
yeah.
thank you so much for geeking out with me there, and I think recognizing who's listening in. There were lots of sports psychs always listening in, and we're the people who are going to go away and continue to read about, understand, research eyes off individual zone of optimal functioning, which for those listening in is Yuri Hanin's work, the Norwegian psychologist, from his work with Russian divers originally back in the 1970s, and understanding that actually people perform with different types of emotional experiences and at different levels of anxiety, essentially arousal anxiety. Challenge and threat we've talked about a lot on the Sports Psych Show. We've had quite a few episodes on that. ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, which we're going to explore probably in a bit, getting from performance type 3 to 2. And then obviously Clutch and Flow, Dr. Matt Schweikel and Dr. Christian Swan, we spoke with them about those. Those are some of the underpinning theories. I think let's work together here for those coaches listening in. Look, they don't necessarily need to know the underpinning theory necessarily, but what do these four types mean for
Mhm.
from I suppose a more practical, pragmatic perspective for coaches listening in?
Yeah, I think they can be a helpful first, like a helpful framework to
Yeah.
put anything you see athletes do or athlete experiences. It can be a
Mm,
helpful framework for those. I think the important thing to keep in mind is these characteristics. It's not an exhaustive list.
yeah.
Um, there's probably going to be overlap because humans are complex, and it's the most interesting part of coaching or any work with athletes that we don't fit into these exact types all the time. So
Absolutely.
I think it may be helpful for a coach to recognize, okay, I see this athlete put in a lot of effort. And then the question is, does it pay off in optimal performance or does it not pay off in optimal performance at this particular point in time?
Mm,
Doesn't necessarily need to be a question that you consider over a longer time at this point, but it could be helpful to see, is the emotion that the athlete experiences, is it a pleasant, positive experience, or is it more negative? I think the important thing to remember is then to reflect back onto the athlete and see, like, how can we being coaches at this point, help the athlete in attaining a more optimal performance state or a more optimal emotional state, depending on what maybe the athlete needs at this point as well. So there are four performance types with lots of characteristics, but just keep in mind that there's way more to this than that is currently described as well. So the interesting thing, I think, for example, about flow state, is that there might be some experiences that fit into a type 1 performance type but aren't necessarily flow state, for example.
Okay.
Or they there's maybe like tiny little moments of flow state, and then the person comes out of it again, and they might not be able to even articulate it properly. There's maybe an important consideration for type 1. Type 2, how much effort is getting put in? Does the athlete feel it's a positive experience still? It's and maybe even see type 1 and type 2 like on a spectrum. There might be like a very dynamic transition between type 1 and type 2 that are very quick. So I think the most important thing is to not kind of shoehorn athlete experience into these types because they seem so distinct. But yeah, it's a more dynamic concept in that sense.
It's complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
To use that term, and this is what the Sports Psych show is all about. We're not invested here in saying, well, just take responsibility and all kinds of fairly simplistic memes and things like that. So I love trying to unpack the complexity, because performance is complex. And I suppose with that in mind, I mean, you're invested in this every single day. I'm going to ask a question here that slightly puts you on the spot, I suppose, with regard to your own experiences with performance. But you're invested in this every day. You're doing a PhD. You have enormous amounts of expertise and knowledge in this area. How have you utilized this for your own performance, musical performance? Are there things that you specifically do that you utilize to try to help you get into that performance type 1 flow state in its very simple form, or deal with performance type 2 to be able to be effortful? Are there things, whether it's your running or whether it's your music, what is this meant for you in your preparation and in performance mindset and state?
Yeah, I think the answer would depend on what domain I'm talking about. This is exactly
Okay.
again kind of the messiness. So
Yeah.
if I transfer it onto my PhD work, I'm gonna be very honest, and I came to the conclusion I don't experience type 1 a lot. It is
Constantly grinding away at the laptop.
there is a lot of grinding, absolutely. I think it's maybe recognizing I may have to, this is really specific now, but I may have to like give myself half an hour of very focused work to even tap into some elements of type 1. Don't expect it to happen from the very start, or don't expect to be motivated before you start working, things like this. I mean, it's a lot of self-awareness that is now like specific to me. I think my PhD work a lot of the time is on a type 2 and type 3 spectrum, where I'm maneuvering in between. And if I get too much into the type 3, I know that I need to take a break and walk my dog, and just step away from it and
Yep.
restart after. If I'm getting towards type 4, which thankfully doesn't happen too much, then I usually know that I need to call Dave Collins, my supervisor, and ask ask for some help.
Dave,
And
I give up. I
he
give
comes.
up. I
I
withdraw
know.
from what I'm doing here. Please,
Yeah,
please help me re-engage.
exactly. No, I'm extremely lucky. I couldn't ask for better supervisors. Really, they're absolutely wonderful. But I think it's maybe um, doing some reflection on what the cues might be that get you into a type 3 performance or into a type 4
Mm.
performance or a type 2. um, and I don't know. I definitely think about it in a music perspective, in a music context as well. I even have chatted to loads of my colleagues before. It usually starts with like, "Oh, so what is it that you're doing your PhD on?" And then I try and explain what it is, and they're like, "Oh, this is really interesting, but it's quite difficult." And then we get into like how type 1 isn't necessarily always the be all and end all in performance. Like, you, especially when you work in jazz, and I can see that in myself, or in a folk music context. Like, you have to listen so much to other people. You have to be consciously switched on. You can't necessarily just sit back and monitor what you're doing. Like, there's things happening all the time that require your attention and your energy, and it's you need to adapt very quickly to different situations. So again, I think if like a gig is going well, you're going to be mostly in type 2 with some moments of type 1.
Well, can I ask you this? 'Cause that's really interested me there. So, as a violinist who's predominantly engaged in jazz, as opposed to, I suppose, the classical form of
Mhm.
music, um, would it be absolute broad brush, naive, ignorant statement here? But if you're a violinist, and most are, I suppose, doing classical music, would type 1 be a more familiar performance state to try to get into, to strive to get into? Whereas I think I'm hearing you say in jazz, where perhaps you're trying to create, you're trying to align with mental models, and you're trying to listen to others, and you're having to really effortfully engage with others. Is there more of a type, actually the type 2 is the kind of optimal state that you want to be in?
Yeah.
Or is that far too general a statement?
I'm not sure. I think it's, again, it's so messy in real life. I think in
Yes, of
in in
course.
jazz, like, you have these phases of where you play with your band on like a set melody. We call it the head, and then there's phases of
Mm.
improvisation. So I think, and this has actually come out of my dissertation research and for my MSc, in the improvisation part, you are much more likely to tap into flow than you when you are playing the head, meaning the melody, with other people. They're playing the same thing essentially.
Really?
It's this idea
Okay.
of you come up with novel ideas. You have to be, or you can be, very creative, and that is stimulating. This idea of something being autotelic, that was described in
Yes.
in flow state. It's like an
Yep.
inherently satisfying experience, because you are creating and you are being flexible, and you're maybe surprising yourself even with what you can come up with. So I think
Okay.
in jazz, um, flow state is more likely during an improvisation set. Now, in
Gotcha.
classical music, again, it depends. If you're working with an orchestra, or you're playing, say, like violin and piano, there is just less things that can go wrong, in the sense like that it's much more prescribed what you're doing. You're playing off a score, you're playing off your part. um it's very different to jazz, where in jazz you have to always come up with new things, or you're creating on the spot, you're composing on the spot essentially. This is not what's happening in classical music. So in some ways, maybe in classical music, and this is, I don't know, I don't have any evidence for this, but maybe more likely to get into a flow state, because you don't need to expend too many resources on thinking
Yeah.
creatively, or it's like, oh, what is the next note going to be? You know what the next note is going to be. So um,
Yes.
I,
Yeah.
I think this is maybe where it stands. And folk music, traditional music, is very much like jazz in that sense. It depends how much of a degree of freedom do you allow yourself to kind of compose on the spot or improvise.
Really interesting. Before we talk a little bit about striving to move from type 3 to 2, I did notice in your paper, which I should say is co-authored by your supervisors, Alan MacPherson, Dave Collins, and also Maurizio Bertollo. Um, you speak a little bit to self-determination theory,
Hmm.
and obviously intrinsic motivation, Deci and Ryan's theory of intrinsic motivation, and obviously their work, demonstrating that intrinsic motivation, they would claim to be a higher um, form of motivation, a more powerful form of motivation over extrinsic motivation. And I am a fan of that, in terms of if one engage in something one enjoys and you're doing it for the sake of doing it rather than doing it for a reward, an external reward, or to avoid a punishment. It makes sense to me that motivation, intrinsic motivation, is the most powerful form of motivation. However, again, the messiness, the chaos, the complexity, and I love the fact this framework and the theories speak to this, is that it strikes me that in type 2 this isn't necessarily about self-determination. This can also explore extrinsic motivation. Would I be right in saying that we can lean on extrinsic and external rewards to drive some of these types? Am I correct in saying that?
I think absolutely. I think most, or hopefully, it's a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation that
Yes.
uh, keep you engaged in a certain type, or even um, cause a transition from, say, type 3 to type 2. Um,
Okay.
I mean, our work currently, which is not published yet, we're just finishing the data analysis, and we'll write up soon. But it's in judo,
Okay.
so it's a setting where you have an opponent, and the opponent may do something that either you're like, oh, I can really latch onto this. I know exactly what to do with this technique and combat,
Mm.
like, or kind of, yeah, decide to exchange for myself here. So this would be an extrinsic cue in a sense, but it causes like intrinsic motivation in the sense that you realize, oh yes, I can latch onto this.
Yep.
I can get to where I want to get here. So the complexity is, I think, around um, the maybe also the emotional side of
Okay.
this. So um, is what is the consequence of the intrinsic motivation? Is it like positive affect in the sense I mean, there's a point in the paper where I quote affect as information theory, which basically says uh, affect can be a cue, a metacognitive cue for transition to a more optimal
Yep.
state. So I think again, it's linked back to transitions. It's linked back to upregulation,
Hmm.
which is the goal of sports psychology. Actually,
Yes.
like we want to get athletes to experience more optimal states from, and kind of do that in a reliable sense as well. So the 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 idea is maybe it isn't necessarily always type 1 that is the most rewarding state. It could also be type 2. um and yeah, it's again, it's like, so it's very
Well,
messy.
let me tell you what I'm hearing here. I mean, I
Hmm.
do a lot of work in football, soccer, and it's commonplace for, let's say, a soccer player 3 quarters through the game getting angry at themselves, for maybe making a few mistakes, or being 1-0 down, for example, and giving themselves a good talking to, self-talk,
Yeah,
up-regulation, as you'd say,
yeah.
and and potentially moving up to performance type 2, if we're going to define it in that manner, from 3 to 2, for example.
Hmm.
If we look at the conversations we've had around challenge and threat states, and as you mentioned earlier, it's not that threat is all bad. It's when I feel threatened, that can spark me into action. And so what I'm hearing you say is that um, actually performance is more complex than, just get into a flow state. It's
Which is
actually,
great. Which
yeah,
which is
which is
which
great.
is which is amazing if that is available to the performer.
Mm,
But I think the tricky thing about flow state, it's just not necessarily clear when and how and why it is available, and the strategies you can apply to get into it. I mean, is this wonderful state, and I mean, I've experienced, I hope everyone in some shape or form has experienced it at some point. um but it's like it's a less reliable aim in that sense, because you it's not exactly clear how you
yes,
get there. So it's, if you aim for type 2 first, you put yourself into a better position to maybe get into type 1 as a result of doing well and experiencing positive emotions because of that.
I would also add that it feels to me, and the conversations I have with athletes who compete in team invasion sports, for example, and other sports, golf and racket sports and etc., is that it's an unrealistic proposition,
Hmm.
because these sports are challenging, they're tough, they're hard. You come up against opposition playing really well, and so if my sole strategies are to upregulate into flow state, well, as you've alluded to, not only do we not really know how to do that reliably and consistently, actually it kind of goes against the notion of the sport as a challenge.
Hmm. Hmm.
That these things are just too tough
Hmm.
to reliably say, oh well, I'm just going to find flow state and that's okay. It kind of summed up, this is complex, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably, and again, this is actually kind of drawing onto the work that I'm writing up just now. I've asked judoka to basically track performance types across like a 4-minute performance. So they were watching themselves on video and said, okay, I'm in type 1 here, then I'm going into type 2, type 3, back to 2, I don't know, back to 3 and to 4. I don't know. This is
Yep.
just an example, and we were talking about the
Yeah, yeah.
cues, like it may be fatigue that causes you to go from 2 to 3. Um, it, all of this stuff there. There's so many different pathways an athlete can take throughout a performance. But the interesting thing is most of them started in some form of type 1, and then because they're physical and mental, but mostly physical resources, energy, just kind of physical momentum started to deplete.
Yep.
They're like I can't really stay in type 1 for that long. It's definitely more of a type 2 just now, and then you go into 3, and it's really a struggle from there on, because it's physically
Yeah.
so taxing. Um, the other the other aspect to this is because, I mean, flow is characterized as this s- state where there is an absence of thought. So you're not really thinking about consciously controlling your actions all the time. So, and this was just kind of a thought experiment that me and Alan and Dave kind of went through in a meeting, where we're like, how do athletes actually know that they're in flow then? If it's something where they're not really thinking, in the sense like it's not exactly clear that they're in flow. Like it's more like this, you appraise something as flow after the performance, so it's more like an appraisal of a certain type of performance rather than a specific state you want to achieve at this specific time. So again, we don't I don't have any clear answers. This is just kind of something that we were thinking about, but I think it just shows the complexity of flow, and as amazing as it is, and I mean, it's in a way the most efficient form of performance. Your actions are automatic, you or more or less automatic. It may be just a more realistic position to aim for 2 and then allow for type 1 and flow state after that.
Have you ever read the book Thought in Action by Barbara Gale
Actually, I
Montero?
haven't, no.
That is an awesome book on exactly what you're
All
talking
right.
about, which actually pushes back against this idea of no thought and that it's thought in action,
Uh-huh.
that thought is constantly happening.
I mean, yeah, it's an optimal
Yeah,
balance of
yeah,
demands and
yeah,
skill. It's a constant feedback loop for sure. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's not saying her thesis in the book, and I really want to get her on the sports site show. She's a philosophy lecturer at New York University, I believe, but works in dancing and has been a dancer. And her philosophy is
Great.
it's not suggesting that we're constantly thinking about our technique, or it's self-monitoring or reinvesting, and we're constantly thinking about strategies or tactics. That's not what she's saying. But she's saying essentially what we're proposing, what you're proposing there, is that our mind is all over the place, and it's scanning, it's monitoring, it's
Mhm.
external, it's internal, it's broad, it's narrow, it's tactically oriented one second, it's and technically oriented another. It's can be thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, etc., etc. So, it's constantly functioning, and it also makes me, listening to what you're saying there, also makes me, and this whole theory also makes me think of, the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she's been on the show, neuroscientist, and her work around emotional states and the theory of constructed emotion,
Oh yeah.
but this notion of
Mhm.
interoception,
Mhm.
the interoception being that our body is constantly sending our brain data, which the brain computes as feeling. And feeling is constantly happening, and that's really brought down to two forms of feeling: pleasant, unpleasant, aroused, unaroused. So yeah, no question, but it's just my own thought experiment there, I suppose.
No, I think that's quite important because it shows the complexity of it all, and again, I think that, I mean, we listed some concepts earlier that are underpinning to MAP, but I think um probably, if you looked into the evidence base in general, there's going to be a lot of similar narratives,
Mm,
especially around effort and emotion and upregulation. I think that, and this was actually for me the hardest part at the start of my PhD. I realized all there's all these wonderful bits of research, but they're using quite different language to describe very similar things, um, and it's
yes.
it's trying to import critically what other um, researchers have done and see how it applies. And then, I mean, for me, like my aim is to work as an applied practitioner eventually as well. I feel like it's that intersection of theory and practice where it's most interesting, I think.
And yeah, absolutely. And it also demonstrates to me the importance of eclecticism as an underpinning philosophy, and pragmatism potentially at the
Hmm.
coalface, because
Hmm. Hmm.
as you've emphasized all the way through this conversation, it's complex, and it's individual specific, and it's context specific. So having,
Yeah, yeah.
whether eclectic approaches, and being as pragmatic as possible can be important. Um, I'm mindful that we haven't really spoken about. We've mentioned a few things around going from type 3 to 2. Um, uh, Talk to me a little bit more about that. You've mentioned a few things, but when you think of going from 3 to 2, what's at the forefront of your mind? What do you think athletes can do? What do you think coaches can help athletes do, go from 3 to 2?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to write this up very articulate, hopefully, in
That's
in a
fine.
new paper. So I'm going to give you some ideas, and uh, I think a lot of it is based on anticipation and expectancies. So expecting that type 3 is going to happen probably at some point.
Agreed.
It should it as long as it doesn't come too much as a surprise. This is usually the first step. Then, and I'm referring mostly to the work that I've now done in a judo setting. Self talk is really, really important. Like trying to regain some form of mental composure through how you talk to yourself, and this really, again, is idiosyncratic, unfortunately. This makes everything more complex. Some might work better if they're getting quite angry at themselves and they're talking to themselves quite aggressively.
Yep.
Others, it's more instructional, so they're talking themselves through, okay, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. It's like it's very, very different. Others put the whole performance into context and say, oh well, listen, this is just rundori, this is just a practice fight. Now let's try and get back to it and just try and restart. So I think it depends a lot on each person and what each person needs to perform well. And another one is, I mean, in judo specific, you get feedback from your coach in between exchanges. So
Yep.
it's like this kind of triangulation process of doing your own debrief, like inside, basically, like an internal debrief, and then seeing what the coach says. There, and this is actually where it all comes full circle. There's maybe some shared mental model between you and your coach. You don't necessarily have to communicate overtly about yes, coach, thank you, like this is not necessarily needed. The coach will know you very, very well, and will know what you need at this point. The coach can see more than you at this point. So this kind of triangulation of internal and external factors, a, maybe a general acceptance, and this is where Mac comes in again. Like you can't change the past exchange, especially one judoka said this very articulate. Like she was like, it's over. I might as well just move on.
Yeah.
And
Mac
you,
being mindfulness, acceptance, commitment. Yeah.
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Should have explained. This. But again, this is something I think the person that mentioned this works wonderful for them, but it definitely, I have one person in mind where that wouldn't work at all. Like they're needing a much more kind of aggressive type of self-talk. So self-talk, expectancies, anticipation, a general feeling of familiarity as well. Like I have applied this strategy before, it has worked before, therefore I'm going to try again. Trust your coach, and these, keep in mind that these experiences are specific to judo just there, but I think the concept of self-talk and expectancies, anticipation, etc., that's, I think, hopefully more transferable to other domains as well.
Question for you, final question. With your working judo, if I may ask, my understanding is a way to potentially upregulate, so go from 3 to 2, if we're going to define it that way, having, say, core action components. Yeah, having, just looking back at some of the research from some of the original authors here, like Monsi Ruiz and Claudia Rabatza, talking about, although I think this action components is from Bertollo.
Most of the MAP research has used the selection of a core component as the starting point for then whatever they were trying to do after.
And that's just having sort of 1, 2, 3 specific cues related to performance. Would I be right in saying that?
Yes.
Sort of specific and controllable actions that I, as a performer, can come back to.
Yes. And the interesting thing is actually this is athlete led. It is not the researcher identifying a certain action from, say, the evidence base, the ominous evidence base that we always quote. It's coming from the athlete. The athlete will know best what are the crucial elements of their performance, and using that as a starting point, I think, is quite an important step. But sorry, I interrupted you. Actually, was there a question?
No. You interrupted me to clarify things. And that feels, coming back to this notion of shared mental model between coach and athlete, that's surely something that one can utilize to create some quite strong shared mental models. Coach sits down and co-creates action components with their athletes.
Absolutely. I mean, in judo specifically, this was, for example, the grips. So how they grip their
Yeah.
opponent. That seems to have a huge impact on how well or not so well the rest of the exchange goes. But again, it's the specific to domain, and it's specific to the task. And even though MAP so far has done work mostly in sports, and this is my personal opinion, I reflect it onto music. I can give you a core component in music.
Please
my,
do.
my partner, he's a drummer. He can give you a core component on drumming. So it's like,
Mm.
it's very transferable, I think.
I can definitely give you some core components on golf, and
Yeah.
I'm working on core components with clients all the time. As you said, it's athlete. If we're talking about true athlete driven, it's asking questions to help the athlete come up with their core components, or facilitating a process where athletes and coaches come up with that together. And I find that just so powerful.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Bernadette, just fascinating. Just has been a fantastic opportunity for me to geek out in an area that I am fascinated with, and everything that this encompasses. It's why I write every day about, for me, in my humble opinion, the importance of athletes having frameworks to the mental side of their game, because the brain, the body is complex, and I think athletes, performers require cues and triggers and things to be able to help them find those optimal performance types 1 and 2.
Mhm.
And I know that you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. So how can people, is it possible to find this paper at all? I know it's part of your PhD. And how can people get to learn more about your work and follow you on social media?
Yeah, so the paper is open access, and probably the best way to find it is go to my Twitter, which is
Mhm.
at Bern Kellermann, and Kellermann with 2 N's because I'm German. So it's a pinned tweet, and it links straight to the paper, and it's on ResearchGate as well. I am currently not too active on Twitter, but it's maybe a New Year's resolution for me. So I maybe should get a little bit more proactive. But I mean, this paper, it's taken really kind of 2+ years until it got published. So it was a lot of work until it eventually got out into the world. But I hope, I mean, considering the pace of academic publishing, can only be a matter of years until the next few papers are coming out. But yeah, there's at least 2 other ones, more onto the applied side, coming out. So
Fantastic. Bernadette, I can't thank you enough for your time today.
well, thank you, Dan. Really, really honored to be here.
Well, everybody, I really did enjoy that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.